Arthur Miller, one of those famous authors whom I've just kind of known about for a long time, but haven't actually been interested in reading anything by him until fairly recently. And it kind of came about in a funny way. I'm not really someone who listens to a lot of pop music. I mean, there are some artists that I really like and some independent musicians that I follow, but I don't really listen to a lot of mainstream stuff unless I'm in the car and the traffic is bad and I'm super bored. So, but that's kind of how this came about, and don't worry, we'll get to Arthur Miller very soon. But I was in the car one day, and I switched on the radio and was sort of flipping through the top hits channels, and I came across a song that I could actually really relate to. 21 Pilots is the band, and it was their song Stressed Out, which won them a Grammy a few months ago, and it's just super, super popular right now. So yeah, so that's how I came across 21 Pilots, but then that led me to sort of learn more about the band and how they came up with that name. And it turns out that 21 Pilots is a reference to a play by Arthur Miller. And as I was sort of exploring their music, and I don't really like all of their music, but some of their music I really do love and enjoy. So I was really curious to see, well, what's this play about? So that's how I decided to read something by Arthur Miller. And his more famous work, at least to me, is the play called The Crucible, and I did end up reading that one as well, and I'll talk about that a little later. But first things first, Arthur Miller. 3 things you need to know about him. He was born in New York City in 1915, so right during World War I. And he was born into a family that was pretty well-to-do, in fact, pretty wealthy, until the stock market crash of 1929, and they lost a great deal, and he ended up having to work all kinds of jobs to get himself through college. So yeah, a very, very sudden transition for him from his early childhood to his early adult life in the Great Depression. The next thing that's kind of interesting about him is that he was a playwright, of course, and a screenwriter, and as such, Miller worked with a number of famous actors and actresses. At one point, he was actually married to Marilyn Monroe, and he also became the father-in-law of Daniel Day-Lewis of Lincoln fame and Last of the Mohicans. So there's some more classic literature references for you. And then, of course, he's also, Arthur Miller is also very famous for the whole controversy, I would say. During the Red Scare, which was late 1940s to late 1950s, we're talking about the sudden onset of paranoia about communism and about people in the United States who might have communist ties or sympathies. There was a big crackdown against that, and during that time frame, this Elia Kazan mentioned Arthur Miller's name before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and this committee was sort of investigating accusations of people who might be communist or communist sympathizers. This Elia Kazan was also the director of Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, and that's kind of how he got to know Miller and how Miller got to be investigated as a communist or potential communist. And, yeah, that was a very difficult time in Miller's life. And interestingly enough, his experiences under McCarthyism led him to write one of his most famous works, which is The Crucible, a play about the Salem witch trials. But it was more of a symbolism for the current political atmosphere that, at least according to Arthur Miller's perspective of the Red Scare. So yeah, I'll link to a really interesting short little article about that. It's actually an excerpt from his testimony, but I thought that was an interesting fact about Miller and kind of gives you an immediate connection between his writing and the politics of his time and of perhaps this time in different ways. But I'll get to that a little bit later. I wanted to start with talking about the play that inspired 21 Pilots, the band, at least inspired their name. And this play is called All My Sons, and it was Arthur Miller's first big hit. This was 1947. I think it won a Tony Award, so it was a really big deal. And All My Sons follows two families, and these are families that are sort of middle-class families. This is just after World War II. So back then, this would have been like a contemporary play. And the two families are the Keller family. That's Joe, the father, Kate, his wife, and their sons, Chris and Larry. And it also talks about the Deaver family, Steve Deaver, the father, and his two children, Anne and George. So the basic plot of All My Sons is, it's kind of a retrospective play. It's about the aftermath of some very tragic events. Joe and Steve used to work together running this factory making parts. And during World War II, their factory was commissioned by the government to create parts for airplanes. And so what ended up happening is during this one point in their career, their factory shipped out flawed parts to the military. And this caused 21 U.S. planes and their pilots to be destroyed during flight. And there was a huge, court case and investigation. And ultimately, this Joe Keller claimed no responsibility, and he was found to be innocent in court, whereas his friend Steve went to prison. And this book is kind of about that whole shadow over Joe Keller's character and question whether he actually was partly or at all responsible for this disaster, or if he is indeed innocent as he claims. And that's kind of where his son Chris is questioning. And the other son, Larry Keller, he's no longer living, and his death also plays a big role in this story, and how the characters are remembering these past events and how they're trying to move forward or not. And so it was a really compelling premise, I was really interested to read this story. I can see why the band 21 Pilots got their name from this, because 21 Pilots, a lot of their music's pretty dark and heavy, and this whole play is kind of got that same feel to it, and sort of this battle with moral dilemma or moral questioning. But in spite of this really interesting plot, I felt like the characters were kind of weak, and I really couldn't point to any character that I really felt a long-lasting sympathy for. There was this sort of conflict between Joe Keller and his son Chris, where Chris was really not comfortable with his father's role in what happened and really questioning him, and then Joe was, fighting back and defending himself against his son. And yet I felt like the dynamic was kind of imbalanced, and I felt like it was kind of imbalanced in favor of Chris the son, and it just didn't work for me. I felt like the dialogue was very down to earth, very convincing, very much everyday type of speech. And yet I just didn't really get that resonance with the characters that I like from a story, and I felt like the ending was pretty terrible, by the way. I don't want to go into that, but it was a very depressing play throughout, and I just didn't get much from it that I felt like was worthwhile. In spite of, again, the great premise for a plot, I bet it could be retold by maybe a film director or somebody to be more compelling throughout, but I don't know. One thing I will say, and this is something that really impressed me, was it's a very minimalist play. It's got maybe one or two sets, and I was impressed that he could tell such a story through very little staging, and I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, that was All My Sons. Kind of a disappointment, but still interesting and might be worth your time if you're just looking for something to read or you're really curious about what 21 Pilots decided to name their band after. So I actually was impressed enough by the writing style alone that I decided to read another play by Arthur Miller, and I decided to read Death of a Salesman. I've heard that title before, so I thought it might be interesting. It's also another of his very famous and highly successful plays. And it's actually where I took our opening quote. It was a little dialogue between the two brothers. So Death of a Salesman was written or published in 1949. And this follows another family, another sort of middle-class American family. This is the Lohman family, the father Willie, the wife Linda, and then the sons Biff and Harold, or Hap. And then there's this Uncle Ben, who's kind of a comes and goes type of a character. But that's basically the main characters of Death of a Salesman. And the salesman in question is Willie, the father. And he's kind of an elderly guy. His life has kind of, I would say, reached a crisis point. Both of his sons are back living at home. Neither one of them has been super successful in life, not the way he would hope. Willie is suffering from memory problems and confusion. And on top of that, he's been a traveling salesman for this company for many years. But he wants a better job that allows him not to have to travel so much to, so he can improve his health and stay with his family. But his boss just won't accommodate him. So there's this initial and sort of permeating feeling of hopelessness for Willie. And he sort of transfers that over to his sons as well. And perhaps with reason, because they don't have much to show for themselves, even though they're like in their 30s or so. And it's just kind of a bleak story about this failing, this guy with failing health and sort of failing ideals even though he's holding on to his beliefs of what he thinks is right to do and what brings him happiness and what makes a person successful. You still see the proof in the pudding that he is not happy and not necessarily successful. So that is kind of an overall summary of Death of a Salesman in terms of the plot. There's not a lot of plot, but I really loved the format of this play because, again, it's retrospective, so it's very similar to All My Sons. But Death of a Salesman is much more effective. The scenes are changing rapidly from past to present, and you get this sense of flashbacks. And there's characters that come in and out of the story. And I mean, it would be really cool to see it on stage, I think, just for that aspect of it alone. It's very psychological. And that always interests me visually and cinematically. Another thing that I enjoyed about Death of a Salesman, and what made me think it was even better than All My Sons, is that the characters were weak, still pretty weak, but they were more interesting and more like, I don't know, maybe they were kind of stronger in their weaknesses. Maybe that's what it was. So you've got Willie, who is kind of this stereotypical salesman. He totally believes in himself and his way of success, and that's primarily based on his idea that you need to be liked, and you need to build something with your life, and you need to command respect. Emphasis on command. So he's kind of this proud character, but he's also kind of obsequious, and he just wants to be liked, to be honest. And he kind of relates that to his personal success, which is kind of sad in a way, because he also has a very low self-opinion at some points. For example, he has this great hope for his sons because he thinks they're more physically attractive than him. He calls them Adonises at one point, referring to the Greek god Adonis. And he describes himself as fat and he's kind of obsessed with his own strengths, but also his shortcomings and his moral shadows as well. He's kind of one of those characters that seems to be all about other people, and yet he's very much also about himself. he's just very proud and not in a good way, I would say. He doesn't really hold his sons up to a very high standard, and he doesn't listen to his wife when she gives him good advice, which is kind of sad when she really wants what's best for him. And that leads us to Linda, the wife. Now, Linda's also kind of a stereotype. She's kind of a stereotypical housewife. This is kind of summed up in one scene where she's mending some stockings, and that makes Willie upset because he actually bought stockings for some lady friend of his that he'd had on a business trip. So, kind of this almost exaggerated and yet in some ways perhaps true to life image of a woman who's absolutely loyal to her husband almost no matter what. And yeah, so she's loyal, and that's a strength of hers, but in a sense she's also very much an appeaser, and I think she's too much of an appeaser to somebody like Willie, who is not always right, and he's not a very good example, and he's often kind of petty and self-absorbed. And you also feel like Linda is just kind of abdicating moral responsibility by her submissiveness to him, when clearly she seems to know better, and yet she's not trying to put her foot down in a true sense. So that was kind of a interesting relationship there that, again, kind of stereotypical, and yet also an interesting set of characters. Then there's the sons. Again, there's a parallel with All My Sons, because Chris from All My Sons, he has a rocky relationship with his father, Joe Keller, and then you see the same thing here with Biff. And Biff Loman, he doesn't trust his father, and he doesn't feel like he needs to live up to that necessarily, and there's just this discomfort with what his father has built or become, contrary to what his father would like him to think, feel, and see in his life. So yeah, that's Death of a Salesman. I think it's worth reading, actually. It's a much more compelling tale than All My Sons. It's still very, very bleak. So don't go into it expecting any kind of comedy or lightheartedness, but I thought it was interesting. The third play that I decided to read, since I had this collection of Arthur Miller plays from the library, I decided to read The Crucible because that's the one that I've heard about a lot, and I've seen it around on the internet, and I'm just kind of curious. I don't really necessarily seek out books about the Salem witch trial or other historical atrocities, but I thought it would be an interesting read, and I don't know, I just thought, I'll read it. It's famous, I'll read it. It's set in the Salem witch trials during the late 1600s, and the characters are all based on real people, although I would say they are set in this more fictionalized narrative. So there's kind of some soap opera elements, at least in terms of the interesting relationships between John Proctor and Abigail Williams and so on. So yeah, but it's based on a historical context, and overall I thought it was pretty good as historical fiction. I enjoyed it as much as you could enjoy something like this. The story's about, there's these girls and they start accusing people of being witches, and pretty soon the whole town is in a flurry, and they're rounding people up and taking them to prison and interrogating them, and it's just really horrible. And then this play kind of focuses on a few characters in that struggle. The antagonists, like Reverend Paris and Abigail Williams, his ward, and also John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth, who get caught up in the controversy because they're suspected of being involved in witchcraft, and a few other people that are just their neighbors. And yeah, it's again, it's a very depressing story, but a very, very well written, though. Very interesting to see how people react to being accused of a crime that means death, and how they decide to cope with that, or what they decide to do. What's their line, their boundary, and what is most important to them in the end. One of the characters is John Proctor, who's a farmer, and he's sort of an everyman, but he has a conscience, even though he's not exceptionally religious. He's, I guess you could say he's the quintessential American hero with this sort of tough individualism and a sense of right and wrong, even though he might kind of be more like an outlaw if you were to think about it from strictly legal terms of the day. I guess that's what makes it kind of a classic. It follows that sort of classic character arc, I guess. One thing that Arthur Miller does really well in this play is he builds up suspense and he builds up anxiety, and pretty soon you start to really feel what the characters are feeling in terms of this fear of people that they even speak to and have otherwise had pretty normal contact with as neighbors and fellow townspeople and so forth, and then this sudden hysteria and the way the law does not help you out a lot because of the people that are, carrying out the law. So that was pretty interesting. The whole beginning of this play is actually a political commentary. It's just Arthur Miller, it's a short essay basically by Arthur Miller, and he's talking about the communist and anti-communist movements, of course, sort of interweaving his own experiences through this commentary. And I didn't agree with everything he said, but I thought it was very thought-provoking and still very relevant today. Not just in terms of communist and anti-communist movements, but about political movements in general and the way people treat each other when they have these very strong differing opinions. And I want to finish with an excerpt from that essay because I thought it was honestly as interesting as the play itself. So he writes, "In the countries of the communist ideology, all resistance of any import is linked to the totally malign capitalist succubi, and in America, any man who is not reactionary in his views is open to the charge of alliance with the Red Hell. Political opposition thereby is given an inhumane overlay which then justifies the abrogation of all normally applied customs of civilized intercourse. A political policy is equated with moral right, and opposition to it with diabolical malevolence." So yeah, he talks about how in politics, if you have differing opinions, each side ends up practically demonizing the other, and they do that so that any abuse they can lob at the other side is justified because only their side is moral, right? And he goes into this in great detail and illustration, and I thought that was really interesting and often true. And I think it's a challenge to us today to try not to be as harsh towards each other as people have been in times past and are still today. Trying to realize that politics doesn't have to be about demonizing other people just because you disagree with them, and that hopefully we can work things out without any Salem witch trials, so to speak.